Let's dive into one of the most wild and honestly unbelievable stories in corporate history. It's the story of how a single company, run out of a tiny office in London, ended up conquering an entire continent. Seriously, a company. So that's the big question, right? How on earth did a private corporation, a business whose only real goal was to make money for its shareholders, end up with its own army, its own territory, and eventually control over all of India? Well, the answer is a crazy mix of ambition, strategy, and just being in the right place at the absolute right time. You've got to remember, this whole thing didn't start with soldiers and conquest, not at all. It started with business. Back in 1599, a bunch of English businessmen who called themselves merchant adventurers got together. Queen Elizabeth I gave them a royal charter, basically a monopoly on all trade with the East. And so the English East India Company was born. Their goal? Pretty simple: get rich. But for a group of traders to become a group of rulers, they need a huge opportunity. And to get why that opportunity even existed, we have to look at what was happening in India in the early 1700s. The mighty Mughal Empire, which had ruled for centuries, was starting to crack, leaving a massive power vacuum. And man, this timeline just shows you how fast it all fell apart. It kicks off in 1707 when the powerful emperor Aurangzeb dies. Chaos ensues. Powerful nobles start breaking away, creating their own little kingdoms. And then the knockout blow comes in 1739, when the Shah of Persia invades and completely sacks the capital, Delhi. The weakness of the empire was laid bare for everyone to see. The message was loud and clear: India was up for grabs. And who steps into this messy, chaotic situation? Well, you've got two major European powers who were already bitter rivals all over the globe: the British and the French. Both had their own trading companies in India, and both looked at the crumbling Mughal Empire and saw a golden opportunity to expand. Now, this right here is absolutely crucial. The two companies were built completely differently. The English East India Company was private. It was owned by shareholders, which meant it could make decisions quickly. It was agile. The French company? It was owned by the government, so it was slow, bureaucratic, and always waiting for approval from Paris. This one difference, it would end up being a massive advantage for the British. But you know, at first, it was actually the French who had the big, game-changing idea. Their governor, a guy named Dupleix, came up with a brilliant new playbook. He realized, why just trade? Why not get involved in the local politics? He started picking sides in disputes between Indian princes. By backing a winner, he became a kingmaker. The British just watched, took notes, and well, they were about to perfect that very same strategy. So while the British and French were duking it out for influence down south, the real prize, the one that would pay for an entire empire, was over in the east. We're talking about the masterstroke in Bengal. So why Bengal? Simple. It was the wealthiest province in all of India. I mean, it was the economic engine of the subcontinent, loaded with cash, a huge trade surplus, and home to some of the richest bankers on the planet. But here was its fatal flaw. For all that wealth, Bengal was militarily pretty weak. It was, in short, the perfect target. The whole thing ignites when a new young ruler, Siraj ad-Dowlah, takes the throne. He makes a decision that seals his fate. He refuses to give the British a monopoly on trade. He wanted competition. This, of course, infuriates the company, but it also angers his own powerful local allies, especially the bankers who stood to lose a fortune. So how did the British take Bengal? It wasn't some glorious battle. It was a corporate takeover, plain and simple, executed in 4 steps. First, the British, led by Robert Clive, deliberately provoked the Nawab. Second, they conspired with his own top general, Mir Jafar, bribing him to switch sides. The third step was betrayal. At the so-called Battle of Plassey, Mir Jafar and his huge chunk of the army just stood there. And that led to step 4, control. Siraj ad-Dowlah was defeated, executed, and the company put their man, Mir Jafar, on the throne as a puppet. And the payoff for this scheme? It was insane. This was the beginning of what historians call the Plassey Plunder. The new puppet Nawab was forced to empty the treasury to pay the company. Just look at that number. In the first 3 years alone, 22 million rupees. That was an astronomical, almost unimaginable amount of money back then. And it changed everything. And here's why that money mattered so much. With the wealth of Bengal flooding their accounts, the East India Company could now afford to build a massive, modern, professional army of its own. Let me say that again. The plunder of Bengal directly paid for the conquest of the rest of India. It was the ultimate hostile takeover. Okay, so now the company is flush with cash and has a huge private army. They start expanding. But they didn't just use brute force. Oh no, they were way smarter than that. They developed these clever political tools, these blueprints for building an empire. And one of their most effective tricks was something called the subsidiary alliance. It was just genius in a really ruthless way. Here's the deal they'd offer a local king. We'll protect you from all your enemies. Sounds great, right? But the catch was, the ruler had to let British troops be stationed in his kingdom, and he had to pay for them. He also had to accept a British official in his court who was advising him, and he had to give up control of his foreign policy. It basically turned independent kings into puppets without firing a shot. So what was the end result of this company-led conquest? Well, it was decades of war, economic policies that destroyed local industries, and a system designed to drain wealth out of India. You just can't keep that up forever. And after a century, all that built-up resentment finally exploded in the massive, bloody revolt of 1857. That rebellion was the final act for the company. After it was crushed, the British Crown stepped in and took direct control. But it's so important to remember that people fought back fiercely from the very beginning. And we'll end with this powerful quote from Tipu Sultan. He was the ruler of Mysore and one of the company's toughest opponents. When they offered him one of those subsidiary alliance deals, he flatly refused, saying, "I would better die like a soldier than to be a miserable dependent on the infidels." His words, they just capture that spirit of defiance perfectly, a resistance against a corporation that came to trade but stayed to rule a continent.